Nintendo Switch can't run open world games. Like, can anybody really say that with a straight face? Because I just saw some dipshit come out and try to say that about Nintendo Switch, right? As justification as to why Elden Ring couldn't be on it. Like, oh, Nintendo Switch doesn't handle open world games very well. Then why does it have a better open world game than Elden Ring? How did it put out something like Breath of the Wild in 2017? How did it put out Tears of the Kingdom, right? How does it handle like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet? Like, oh, those aren't good games. Like, you are delusional. Like, straight up, just completely insane is my genuine opinion on this. Like, I said this back in the Wii era as well, but it's especially becoming true in the Wii U and the Switch era, where people are delusionally trying to convince you that the reason that Nintendo doesn't get third-party support is purely because of hardware power. It's purely because these games can't run on Nintendo hardware. Like, oh, the hardware isn't optimized to those kind of games. Like, okay, but just develop for that hardware then. Like, no, they can't do that. Like, but you're alienating an entire demographic of people like who prefer Nintendo hardware. Oh, but it doesn't matter because PlayStation is so popular. Like, again, it is a cope. It always has been a cope, especially in the Nintendo DS and Wii era, but in the Switch era, where we are getting a lot of major third-party ports, right? Where we are getting games like Hogwarts Legacy, like the same year as when they come out on other platforms, like same day when it comes to Mortal Kombat 1. Like, people are deliberately trying to create a narrative that like third parties cannot like succeed on Nintendo platforms, right? That these ports are impossible, that they shouldn't exist, that they just can't run on such weak pathetic hardware, and yet they come out with no issues, right? No cut content, nothing missing, right? It is the same game, right? Uh, so when you look at something like Elden Ring, which is like very simplistic, very basic, it's a very empty, barren, empty open world, right, with nothing in it. Like, you have a handful of bosses strewn across like the map, right? It's an inferior game to Breath of the Wild in every way, shape, and form, in spite of coming out like 6 years later. Like, that's insane to me. Is that it took them 5 years to put out something that wasn't anywhere near as good as Breath of the Wild, right? And then they got mogged by Tears of the Kingdom the following year, right? It took them 5 years to put out Elden Ring, and they immediately get mogged by Zelda again. And Nintendo's putting out a sequel this year, right? Like, like, again, it's embarrassing just how badly that like From Slop has gotten mogged in this situation. But this is the thing, right? People forget, like, when Skyrim came out, people were saying that, like, Nintendo couldn't produce open world games at all. And now you're seeing people like Nintendo dominate the open world sphere with their Zelda games. You know, better than Skyrim, better than Elden Ring. And, like, you still have people trying to say the same thing. It's almost as if that these people have no idea what's actually available on Nintendo consoles. They have no idea what the hardware is actually capable of. They have no idea what's actually coming out on it, what's relevant on the platform, what's available on it, like how big, like all the things you can do in Tears of the Kingdom specifically, right? That prove that their claims that like Nintendo Switch can't run Elden Ring are false. Like, I remember when people were saying the same thing about Nier Automata and Persona 5, right? Again, I called that out for what it was like day one. Same with Ace Combat 7, and like what happens? All of those games come out on Nintendo platforms, right? And meanwhile, you have like the Yakuza devs sitting there like trying to tell us like, oh, actually, our fan base are too mature to play games on kiddie hardware, and like everybody else is like playing Bayonetta 3 and like No More Heroes 3 and SMT 5, like telling them like, shut up. You are like completely delusional. And that's all it is just delusion. Like, they are just making excuses. The real reason that these games don't come out on Nintendo hardware is purely because Sony is blocking them. This is common knowledge when it comes to Game Pass releases. The reason why games don't come to Game Pass right away is because Sony blocks them. And they're doing the same thing to Nintendo consoles. They always have, but they always do this thing where they try to pretend that it's purely a hardware issue, which is kind of interesting considering how this is consistent. This behavior is consistent across all Nintendo hardware. N64, GameCube, Wii, DS, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Wii U, Nintendo Switch. Like, again, all of these different pieces of hardware, like, conveniently don't never see the same kind of third-party support that PlayStation and Xbox get. Not because they're weaker, inferior pieces of hardware, but because Sony does not want Nintendo to succeed, and they are doing everything they possibly can. Blocking Tekken from coming out on Nintendo consoles. That has been confirmed. Microsoft had to pay a hefty fee to get GTA 4 on Xbox, right? I'm sure it's the same. I'm sure they have to pull similar deals now to get like day and date releases with PlayStation, which is again, this has been going on for a long time. Like, again, people are delusional if you think that third-party developers are ignoring the market leader for no reason, right? Like, again, it's not because of hardware power. Get that through your thick skull, because there are bigger and better games on Nintendo consoles. It is entirely to enable PlayStation to do what they do, to ruin video games and like just drag us all down, to try to drag the entire industry down with them, essentially. It's embarrassing, honestly. And like, again, it really needs to be said. Elden Ring is not that impressive. It's not that big. It's not that like, it's not some monumental like genre-defining thing, right? Like, again, this is a far cry from Final Fantasy VII, which had like full motion video and like a really large soundtrack, right? Like Final Fantasy VII, like you can look at that and see why it couldn't run on Nintendo 64, right? But when you compare it to Elden Ring, like, what exactly is happening here that could not run on a Nintendo Switch? Absolutely nothing, right? If you are even remotely familiar with how game dev works, you would be very well aware that something like Elden Ring would be easily ported to Nintendo Switch with no issues whatsoever.